So I want to talk about some of these major triggers. And so this diagram here that I'm referring to is discussing. Let's see. Let's put this in front. There we go. So this diagram, it says common migraine triggers, but it's not really. This really could say, doesn't have to just say migraine. It could just say headache triggers, common headache triggers. And so think of this wheel as just kind of an example of a number of the different things that we know that can contribute to headache progression. And so just going around this list, we've got nutritional deficiencies, which we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about here in just a minute. We've got hormone problems. We'll also talk about why that's the case. Allergies, and this could be, again, what I said earlier, this doesn't have to be just environmental allergies. It can also be food reactivity. And then gluten, this is not so much an allergy as it is a sensitivity. So when you think about gluten, a lot of people think I'm allergic to gluten. And it's not the same thing. An allergy and a sensitivity are very different, at least biochemically speaking. But a lot of people are gluten sensitive, and that can be a major trigger for migraines. Gluten's a neurotoxin, so it can trigger that neurological response. Alcohol can do it. Sinus pressure or sinus compression or sinus pressure. And that, as I mentioned earlier, these two kind of go hand in hand because allergies can oftentimes create the sinus disturbance. Caffeine is a known trigger for migraine. Dairy products, and one of the reasons this is kind of similar to gluten is that a lot of your dairy products can mimic gluten. If you want to learn more about the connection between dairy and gluten, you can check out one of my videos on gluten versus dairy. Very helpful in that regard. And then processed foods, and this particularly with processed foods, you'll see a lot of these things have correlation. So processed foods oftentimes contain chemicals, but one of the big chemicals they contain is MSG, which is one of the most notorious headache triggers. Artificial sweeteners as well, oftentimes found in processed foods. So again, you're going to see some overlap on this wheel. Muscle aches or muscle tension or muscle spasm. Now, this is one of the most common triggers for a tension headache, but it can also, remember, tension and stress can actually be one of the triggers for migraine. So what happens to a lot of people is they start off with a tension headache and then it progresses. Once it starts, it progresses toward triggering a migraine. We mentioned stress earlier, sugar. So, going back again, look at all the links to processed food, and then environmental stress. So there's a difference between emotional stress and environmental stress. And so environmental stress, think about emotional stress as you're hanging out with people you don't like, you have a job you hate, you're surrounded by people that you don't get along with. And so there's this emotional grief or emotional strife versus, like, let's say an environmental stress, and this could be physical stress. So for some people, it's exercise. I've seen exercise-induced headaches as a result of overdoing it. Physical work is too great. And then we've got chocolate. And one of the things I didn't mention, that we talked about dairy mimicking gluten, but we didn't talk about tyramine. There's a chemical in dairies, particularly in cheese. And so some of your aged cheeses, because of tyramine, can be a major trigger for migraine headache, but also for other styles of headaches. And then chocolate as well. There's a chemical in chocolate called PEA, which in caffeine as well. So PEA and caffeine are both triggers for headaches. And as I mentioned earlier, there's overlap again between several of these. And so the correlation is strong between a lot of these. So again, these are very common migraine triggers. Now, here's why I show you this wheel. I want you to kind of use this wheel to your advantage. You can print it out if you'd like to. And I actually, we'll have in the show notes below the video, we'll actually have a link for you that you can follow. And in that link, you can get an actual copy of this digitized, and you can save it to a thumb drive or you can print it out. But one of the things it has all the research and medical references. And the reason why I want you to have this, I'm skipping a page here, that's this section right here. So these are your medical references. Is I want you, if you're struggling with headache issues and you've had conversation with your doctor, whether that doctor's your GP, your neurologist, whoever it is, right? Your PCP, whatever you've got that you're working with, I want you to be able to take this to them and say, look, we haven't investigated any of these things, and you've got me on 2, 3, 4 medications, and you want me to mitigate this pain with drugs without actually investigating any of these potentials. We always want to start. This is the fundamental premise of headache investigation, is always start with triggers and causes. Okay, so very, very important. So that being said, let's talk about some of these dietary triggers. I'm going to show you some research here because, again, I want you to be able to take some intelligent information to your doctor. Because a lot of times, well, my opinion is if your doctor is not willing to look at this, then you're probably seeing the wrong person and you need to maybe get a second opinion. But this is coming directly from the medical research, right? We've got Journal of Pain Research. You see dietary trigger factors of migraine and tension type headaches. Okay, so this study was done on 684 patients. What they found, is that in 390, they had 319 migraineurs, or people with migraine headaches. They had 365 tension headache patients. And what they found is that 23.1%, so a quarter of these patients, one of the triggers for their headache was missing or skipping a meal. Now, that doesn't mean that if you fast, that fasting is somehow bad. But what's wrong with a lot of these people is they're chronically sick and they don't have a really strong ability to regulate their blood sugar. So missing that meal for some of them creates what's known as a hypoglycemic state. So if you're pre-diabetic or your doctor's ever said your blood sugars are low and then high, fasting might not be the right move for you until you get that under control first. But almost a quarter of these individuals had missing a meal as a potential trigger. So that's not think about that for a minute. That's not eating the wrong food. That's just not eating. That's missing a meal and then not having the ability to regulate your blood sugar as being a culprit. And then you can see here that 37.3% of them, so almost 40%, had dietary triggers. So that's a big chunk of folks, right, struggling with headache, where if we go to the gold standard in medicine, gold standard is what? You walk out of the doctor's office with a prescription drug, okay? I just showed you that almost half of all headache sufferers, at least from this particular study, had food as a trigger. What were the foods? Women, don't hate me, please. I'm just the messenger. Don't shoot me. Chocolate was one of the major triggers. Coffee, food rich in MSG was a trigger, okay? Soft drinks, and this has to do with going back to our diagram here. How can we correlate this information to this diagram? So you've got chocolate, you've got coffee, you've got, which again, down here, caffeine, but also some of the other ingredients in coffee. And then foods rich in MSG, again, your processed foods. And then, so the reason why I'm pointing out some of these things, but not all these things, this is a long list of potential triggers, is something in science called a p-value. You see this number up here, it's called a p-value. What does that really mean to the average person? P-value means the strength of the evidence. So the lower the value is, so if this number, p-value, is less than 0.05, that makes this a very, 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 how do we want to put this? Very scientifically valid association, where the higher the p-value, so if it's above 0.05, then the strength of the evidence is a little bit less. So in this case, again, chocolate, coffee, MSG-rich foods, soft drinks, and instant noodles were the things that had the greatest degree of evidence against them. So what's interesting about instant noodles is that they're a major source of MSG. If you ever went to college and had ramen noodles, every day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, again, can be a major trigger for people's migraine headaches. So that, and again, soft drinks, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned the artificial sweeteners being a common ingredient in soft drinks. If we look at this other study coming out of the journal Headache, okay, you can see here the conclusion was that certain foods, beverages, ingredients within foods may trigger attacks of headache and or migraine in susceptible individuals. Elimination diets can prevent headaches in subgroups of persons with headache disorders. So again, I'm not just kind of bringing this out of thin air and saying, listen to me because I'm right and I'm Dr. Osborne. I'm showing you the experts, the big experts publishing in the major journals are agreeing with me. And if we look at this particular trial was studied. Now, this was a small trial. It was done on a small quantity of people, but look at the statistics of what they found. And this was in a modified Atkins ketogenic diet, which is basically gluten-free. Okay. And so we observed for the first time that a 3-month ketogenesis ameliorates clinical features of a chronic cluster headache. So it's not just about migraines, it's also about cluster headaches as well. So if your doctor's diagnosed you with cluster headaches and he says, oh, diet has nothing to do with cluster headaches, again, it's very, very common for those words to come out of a doctor's mouth. This evidence would show otherwise. Look at what happened. Okay, so in this study, here's what they looked at. The results of the 18, so there were 18 patients in the study. 15 were considered responders to the diet. 11 experienced full resolution. So in this, again, a small study, we need more studies to reconfirm this, but more than half of the individuals in this research study had full remission, okay, full resolution of their headache, and 4 had a headache reduction of at least 50%. Well, those are great odds. Those are great statistics. That's a pretty powerful dietary intervention. And so what was it? There was no treatment. What was the treatment? If you want to call diet change treatment, you can, but there was no medicinal treatment. There were no herbs. There were no drugs. There were no medications that were given. It was just strictly a diet change. Again, very, very powerful. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.